When I was a much younger man, back in my home country of Mexico, I worked as a security guard at a sprawling chemical plant on the edge of town. It was a place of rust and strange odors, a skeleton of pipes and tanks that sighed and groaned in the wind. And since I wasn't the type to kiss my boss's ass like some of the other guards, I was permanently assigned the night shift. At first, I thought I'd hate the profound solitude, the endless hours marked only by the slow crawl of the moon. But after a couple of weeks, I realized it wasn't just easy money. It was peaceful. The daytime was full of noise, the shouting of foremen, the clatter of machinery, the endless gossip. The night was mine. Some of the other guards claimed it creeped them out, that the plant felt like a graveyard after the sun went down, haunted by the ghosts of industry. But I didn't mind it. The silence was a balm. At least, it was until I found those kids. About a year into the job, one of the heavy iron bar gates at the front entrance suffered a minor malfunction. Years of neglect had worn the locking mechanism down. It could have been a local teenager who finally broke it, looking for a thrill, or maybe word just got around. The bar didn't fully lock when it was lowered. A person could simply get out of their car, lift the surprisingly light bar, and a second person could drive right through onto the plant grounds. The first time, I saw a car parked deep inside the perimeter, tucked away behind a dormant processing unit. My heart hammered against my ribs. I shone my heavy mag light at it, and the vehicle took off toward the front gate like a bat out of hell. I gave chase, my boots crunching on the gravel path, knowing they would have to stop and lift the bar. But I wasn't fast enough. They were gone, leaving only a cloud of dust hanging in the moonlight. I figured it was a bunch of drug addicts looking to strip copper wire or steal whatever they could get their hands on. A couple of nights later, however, when another car appeared in the same spot, I decided on a stealthier approach. Creeping up through the skeletal remains of old equipment, I caught quite a different sight. Two teenagers, a boy and a girl, were trading kisses like it was their last night on Earth. They were so lost in each other that they never saw me. All I wanted to do was tell them to move on. But the moment my shadow fell across their window, they were so embarrassed, they took off like a couple of frightened javelinas. The closest town was deeply conservative and Catholic, where reputation was everything and sin was whispered about behind closed doors. A lot of those kids' fathers were plant employees, which meant they didn't want word of their late-night activities spreading around the locker rooms. It became a kind of silent game, usually. All it took was a slow wave of my flashlight beam across their windshield, and the cars would disappear like magic. But then came the time my magic trick didn't work. I was making my 2A NEM rounds when I saw it. The familiar silhouette of a sedan parked in the usual spot. I shined my flashlight on the trespassing car, expecting the immediate flash of brake lights. Nothing. It didn't move. I figured it was only a matter of time before I got some pushback. Word of a good makeout spot spreads fast among high schoolers. Hell, it probably still does today. So I figured, sooner or later, I'd get a couple of defiant kids who wouldn't leave at the first sight of my light. Annoyed, I started walking towards the car, preparing a stern lecture. "Hey," I called out, my voice swallowed by the vast, empty space. "You don't have to go home, but you can't stay here." The engine was off, and I figured the sound of my voice would have it sputtering to life. But it didn't. There was only silence. I was approaching the back of the car. Through the rear window, I could see two figures inside, their shapes dark against the faint glow of the distant town. I called out again, louder this time. "I am asking you to leave. please. It feels dumb to say it now, but when they didn't respond that time either, I got frustrated. My patience was gone. I strode up to the passenger window, ready to rap my knuckles on the glass and yell, "Hey, I'm talking to you." But the words died in my throat. The kids inside that old car couldn't hear a word I was saying, because both of them were dead. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, and the scene resolved into a nightmare. The boy in the driver's seat was only sitting upright because the thin, vicious wire he'd been strangled with was tied taut to the headrest, digging deep into his throat. His tongue was swollen and protruding, and his face and hands, deprived of life, looked bright, waxy blue in the artificial light. The girl next to him, she looked like she'd been stabbed viciously in the side of the neck. A tidal wave of dried, blackened blood covered her left side, the seat, and the center console. My skin crawled. It was the worst thing I'd ever seen, not just because of how bloody it was, but because their eyes were wide open. The girl's were half closed, as if she were merely sleepy. But the boys were almost bulging from their sockets, preserving that final, explosive moment of death terror for me, and me alone, to see. I don't remember running, but suddenly, I was back in the plant's security office, my breath tearing at my lungs, fumbling with the phone to call the cops. A short while later, a single officer drove over from the town precinct, his skepticism obvious until he saw the car for himself. By the time my shift ended and the sun began to bleed over the horizon, the back of the plant was a full-blown crime scene. Cops were walking around, their voices low and urgent, while a police photographer's flashbulb popped, illuminating the horror inside the car again and again. The guard replacing me, a man named Hector, asked if I was all right. He must have seen the tremor in my hands. I told him I was fine. I just needed a day off to drink and forget. But I couldn't forget. As much as I tried, I couldn't shake the image of those two kids, frozen forever in that car. Every night after that, I'd find myself lingering near that spot, my light tracing the tire tracks that were no longer there. I was truly haunted by what I saw. I found a security job someplace else in the months that followed, but the peace was gone. About a year later, I moved to Arizona with my wife, who was heavily pregnant. Tucson is crazy in its own way, but it's my home now. And while terrible things happen on this side of the border, too, I actually have faith that the police here want to do something about it. I can't say that for my country of birth. It seems odd to think that seeing something so terrible was the start of my journey to the the catalyst for my entire life. But it reminds me of something my abuelita used to say. She'd look at me with her wise, dark eyes and say, "No hay mal que por bien no venga." There is no evil from which good does not come out. The air in my dorm room was thick and stagnant, the kind of heavy warmth that clings to your skin on a late semester night. Back when I was still a college student, sleep was a precious commodity, and on this particular night, I was deep in it, until a sound pricked the edges of my consciousness. It was a murmur at first, indistinct, but it was happening right outside my window. I tried to ignore it, rolling over and pulling the thin blanket over my head, but the voices persisted. It wasn't loud, not a shouting match, but its proximity made it impossible to tune out. Since it was a warm night, I'd left my window cracked open, a desperate invitation for a breeze that never came. And now it was an open channel for a 3A, Drama. My first coherent thought was a surge of pure annoyance. I had an 8 a.m. lecture, and I was already formulating a plan to yell at whoever it was to shut the hell up. But then, as I lay there, fuming, a few words cut through the hushed tones, and the angry fog in my brain cleared, replaced by something else, insatiable curiosity. After I overheard what they were fighting about, the gossip in me suddenly woke right up. It was a boy and a girl. Their conversation, a tense dance between whispers and sharp, rising tones that would flare up before one of them would hiss the other back into silence. At first, I assumed they were a couple having a typical late-night spat, but then the pieces started to click together, and I realized they were an ex-couple. The boy's voice was a low, desperate plea, a constant apology for something he hadn't told her. Her responses were venomous. She called him disgusting, told him he should be ashamed of himself, and said she never wanted to talk to him ever again. And yet, there she was, still talking to him, doing it right under my dorm window in the dead of night. It made me think they were both as bad as one another, one of those famously toxic campus couples, drawn together by a destructive gravity they couldn't escape. But since the tea was being spilled, I figured I might as well drink it. I slipped out of bed, my feet silent on the cool linoleum, and crept toward the window. Pulling back the cheap plastic curtain, just an inch, I peered out from around the edge, trying to place the voices. I was sure I recognized the girl's voice from somewhere. She had to be living in one of the nearby dorms. But the boy's was completely unfamiliar. It was dark outside, the only illumination coming from a single, distant street lamp that cast long, distorted shadows across the parking lot. The couple stood right at the edge of the light's reach, making them little more than silhouettes. The boy had his back to me, his shoulders hunched in a posture of defeat. Without being able to properly ID them, I just kept watching, a secret audience to their circular misery. It was always the same loop. The boy would try to explain himself, his voice a low, washa, earnest rumble. And then the girl would cut him off, her own voice rising just enough for the words to carry clearly. "I hate you," she'd say, the words dripping with contempt. "You disgust me. If I had ever known who you really were, I'd have never dated you." It was clear he was hiding something he didn't want the world to know, which was why he was always the quieter one. But she knew, and she was using that knowledge like a weapon, letting him have it with both barrels. As she launched into another rant about how fundamentally gross he was, he suddenly wheeled around in a spasm of frustration, as if he was finally about to walk away. I almost felt a flicker of relief, but he didn't leave. Instead, he spun back around, and in one fluid, horrific motion, he punched the girl in the face. He hit her as hard as he could. The sound wasn't a Hollywood slap. It was a sickening, wet crack that echoed in the silent night air. The noise the girl made, a choked, guttural gasp as she went down, was so profoundly upsetting that I instinctively slapped a hand over my own mouth, my breath catching in my throat. She collapsed to the pavement like a marionette whose strings had been cut. The boy leaned over her, his fists still clenched, and for a terrifying second, it looked like he was about to hit her again. A surge of adrenaline shot through me, and I scrambled up on my tiptoes to get my mouth to the window screen. "Hey!" I screamed, my voice cracking. "Leave her alone, you piece of crap!" I guess he had no idea he was being watched that whole time. The moment my voice hit the air, his head snapped up towards my window. his eyes wide with panic in the dim light. He froze for a split second before turning and sprinting towards his car. He jumped in. The engine roared to life, and he peeled out of the parking lot like a madman, tires squealing against the asphalt. My yelling had roused other students, and lights began flicking on in windows around the courtyard. Angry shouts of "What the hell" and "Shut up" soon turned into concerned questions as I explained what had just happened. They came running out with me. I figured the boy had knocked the girl clean out with that punch. But when we reached her, the reality was far more terrifying. She was on the ground, her body convulsing in some kind of seizure. It was one of the scariest things I have ever seen, a raw, uncontrollable display of trauma. In that moment, I was convinced she'd hit her head on the concrete curb and was going to die right there on the pavement. Thankfully, she survived with a severe concussion, and her ex-boyfriend was arrested later that week. But the whole thing left a permanent scar on my memory. Even all these years later, I can still hear it, that sickening noise of the impact and the awful final sound she made just before she fell. And just over 20 years ago, when our daughter was still an infant, my wife and I moved from a cramped city apartment to our first home, a modest 2-bedroom townhouse on the edge of the suburbs. From the start, it felt like the place where our life as a family would truly begin. We spent nearly a decade there, and it became the backdrop for the golden years of our daughter's childhood. But that house is also the setting for the most terrifying event of my life. Our street was quiet and safe, a sanctuary compared to the constant vigilance of our old neighborhood. Over time, I let my guard down, though I still locked the doors and windows each night. Life felt peaceful, until one night, everything changed. I was jolted awake by a sound from downstairs, a dull thud that didn't belong. My wife and daughter were both asleep beside me. The realization hit. Someone was in our home. I woke my wife, told her to lock herself in the bathroom with our daughter, and call the police. While she did that, I quietly retrieved my gun from the closet and made my way into the hallways. As I crept downstairs, I expected to confront a burglar, but the sounds were coming from the kitchen, not the living room, where valuables were kept. I pressed myself against the kitchen doorway, heart pounding, then peeked inside. Standing on a chair was a little boy, no older than 6 or 7, digging through our snack cabinet. He wore only shorts, was barefoot, and his skin was covered in scars and crude tattoos. All the anger and fear drained out of me, replaced by sadness. I tried to speak gently, asking if he was hungry or needed help, but he said nothing. Instead, he climbed down, pockets full of snacks, and glanced at the pantry. Suddenly, he darted past me, slipped into the pantry, and disappeared through our doggy door. It was surreal, but it was real. I called the police, not to report a break-in, but to ask them to find and help a child who had clearly suffered unimaginable pain. He needed to be rescued. By the time I had explained the situation to my wife, her initial terror had faded, replaced by the same profound sorrow that had gripped me. We sat at the kitchen table, staring at the half-eaten candy bars the boy had dropped. They looked like strange, sad artifacts. The coffee she made was little more than a pretense at normalcy. Our world suddenly felt anything but normal. About an hour after my call, a pair of uniformed officers arrived. They were calm and professional, their presence both a comfort and a stark reminder of the night's strangeness. I recounted every detail I could remember, but my mind kept circling back to the boy's injuries, the scars that seemed to form a pattern of deliberate cruelty. The tattoos that looked more like brands than art, symbols seared into the skin of a child. One officer, a man a little older than me, with tired eyes, listened patiently while his younger partner took meticulous notes. He asked if I'd noticed anything strange about any of my neighbors lately, any behavior that set off alarm bells. I could only answer no. Our street was a portrait of suburban calm. Then, the officer suggested a theory. If the boy was sneaking through doggy doors to steal food, perhaps he was a runaway, starving after days on his own. It was logical, but it felt incomplete. A runaway from what? From whom? What kind of reality forces a 7-year-old to forage for candy bars in the middle of the night? As the officers left, I wished them luck, and meant it with every fiber of my being. God, did I want them to find that kid? In the days that followed, our quiet crescent was briefly transformed. Police cruisers made slow passes, and detectives in plainclothes went door to door with questions that echoed my own. For a short time, I felt a flicker of hope. The system was working. Surely someone must have seen something. Surely a child in that condition couldn't remain invisible for long. But the days bled into a week, and the activity dwindled until it stopped altogether. The police cars disappeared, and the neighborhood returned to its sleepy rhythm. But our home did not. The silence in our house became heavy with unspoken fears. My wife, once as relaxed as I had become, was now a sentinel. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside, sent a jolt of anxiety through her. The doggy door was boarded up the very next day. She began obsessively checking the locks before bed, desperate to rebuild the sanctuary our house once was. She wanted to move on, to forget the night a ghost had slipped through our walls. But I couldn't. Sleep offered little escape. I would close my eyes and see him, the small, bare-chested boy, eyes wide in the kitchen's glare, his skin a roadmap of someone else's cruelty. I felt a sense of irrational responsibility, as if by letting him escape, I had failed him. My wife longed to forget, but I felt an urgent need to remember, to understand. While she slept, I found myself in front of our desktop computer, the modem's screeching handshake with the internet a familiar late-night sound. I would spend hours scrolling through grainy photos on the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children website, reading heartbreaking stories of runaways and abductees. None of them were him. I started buying newspapers from neighboring towns and counties, poring over crime blotters, searching for any mention of a child found or an abuse case uncovered. The obsession became a silent wedge between my wife and me. She would find me at 3 a.m. At the monitor's glow on my face, her expression a mixture of pity and frustration. She just wanted her husband back. I wanted to find the boy. Convinced the police had missed something, I started my own search in the house. I went over the kitchen floor on my hands and knees, emptied the pantry, and combed through the grass and mulch by the doggy door. That's when I found it, tucked deep under the bottom shelf of the pantry, almost invisible against the dark wood, was a small object. It was a piece of dark wood, no bigger than my thumb, crudely whittled into the shape of a bird. The carving was rough, amateurish, clearly made by an unsteady hand. There was a small hole drilled through the top, as if it had once hung from a string. To the police, it might have looked like a forgotten toy, a piece of meaningless debris. But to me, it felt like everything, a tangible link to his existence. Holding this small, secret clue, I felt emboldened to take my search outside. I tried to be casual as I spoke to neighbors, bringing up the break-in during idle conversations. Most just offered sympathy and shock. But one conversation stuck with me. An older woman who lived 3 doors down mentioned the family that used to rent at the end of the street. They were an odd bunch, she said. Her voice lowered. Left in a hurry, you know, right around that time. Didn't even say goodbye. Just packed up a van in the middle of the night and were gone. It was a wisp of a lead. Probably nothing, but I filed it away. A month after the incident, I finally called the detective for an update. The hope I'd been clinging to was extinguished. The response was polite, professional, and utterly final. There are no new leads. The case is still open, of course. We'll let you know if anything changes. I knew what that meant. The case was cold. For everyone else, the story was over. Our street was safe again. My family was safe again. But as I sat in my quiet house, rolling the small wooden bird over and over in my palm, I felt more alone and more certain than ever. The world may have moved on, but I couldn't. I wouldn't. 10 years. A full decade is a long time. It's long enough for an infant to become a bright, funny 10-year-old girl who leaves her shoes in the hallway and argues about her bedtime. It's enough time to trade a starter home for a forever home, a house with a proper yard and a tire swing hanging from an old oak tree. Life had moved on, and it had been good to us. We were happy, settled. The sharp edges of that terrifying night had been worn smooth by the relentless rhythm of everyday life. School runs, soccer practice, family dinners. The constant, gnawing anxiety had long since faded. But the memory of the boy never did. It became a permanent part of my internal landscape, a quiet ghost in the back of my mind. I still had the small, whittled bird. I kept it tucked away in the back of my desk drawer, nestled amongst old keys and forgotten keepsakes. Every so often, I would take it out and hold it, the rough wood a tangible link to a mystery that had sunk deep into the bedrock of my past. The experience had changed me. I became a more protective father, one who checked the locks not just out of habit, but out of a deep-seated knowledge that the world holds horrors you can never truly prepare for it. The night it all came rushing back was a Tuesday in autumn. A light drizzle tapped against the windows. I was in the living room, half watching the local news and sorting through a stack of mail, while my daughter worked on a diorama at the dining room table. It was the picture of domestic tranquility. A segment about a new highway project ended, and the anchor transitioned to the next story. In Westwood County, she began, state officials today began the process of clearing a large, derelict property that has been abandoned for over a decade. My attention drifted until the screen cut to footage of ramshackle buildings and overgrown fields, about 2 hours west of us. The reporter explained the property had a dark history. It was once the isolated compound of a fringe doomsday cult known as the Family of the Final Dawn, which had disbanded abruptly years ago after its charismatic leader died. The story was intriguing, a piece of strange local history, but my ears perked up when the report cut to an interview with a former member. Her face was partially obscured, her voice steady but laced with old trauma. We were taught the outside world was poison, she said, and that children, especially, needed to be purified. They had rituals for keeping the darkness out. The reporter's voiceover continued, explaining that investigators had found evidence of systemic child abuse, and that a key part of the cult's doctrine involved sealing children against corruption through ritualistic markings. My hand stilled over the mail. The woman elaborated. They weren't just punishments, they were brands, symbols of protection, they called them. Each one had a meaning. On the screen, the news station displayed a graphic, a digitally recreated sketch of one of the symbols, a small black glyph, jagged and star-like inside a broken circle. It was identical to one of the tattoos I had seen on the boy's arm 10 years ago. The mail slipped from my fingers and scattered across the floor. My daughter asked if I was okay, but I couldn't answer. The room seemed to shrink, the sound of the television fading to a dull roar. The image of the boy, terrified, scarred, branded, slammed back into my mind with the force of a physical blow. The family of the Final Dawn, a reclusive cult in a rural county. The sudden, middle-of-the-night disappearance of my strange neighbors a decade ago. It wasn't just a lead, it was a key turning in a lock I had thought was rusted shut forever. That night, I didn't sleep. I was back at the computer, but now I had a name. I fell down a rabbit hole of old news articles, forgotten blogs, and online forums where survivors shared their fragmented stories. Every account of the cult's practices reinforced my conviction. The next morning, I dug through an old box of files until I found it. The original police report, the incident number printed at the top. With trembling hands, I called the police department in our old town. I was bounced from records to the cold case unit, each person more detached from the file than the last. Finally, a weary-sounding clerk informed me that the original investigating officers were no longer with the department. One had transferred states, and the other, Detective Miller, had retired several years back. He was the older one with the tired eyes, the one who had listened so intently. On a hunch, I asked the clerk if she could confirm his first name. She did. A little more searching online, and I found a phone number. I stared at it for a full 10 minutes before dialing, my heart pounding. An older, gruff voice answered. "Yeah?" I introduced myself and began to explain, my words tumbling out in a rush. He didn't remember me or the case at first. It was just one of hundreds, a forgotten file from a decade ago. "Listen," I pressed, my voice desperate. The townhouse on Crestview, the break-in that wasn't a break-in, the little boy who came in through the doggy door, the one with the scars. There was a long silence. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed. "The pantry ghost," he said quietly. "My partner and I, we called him the pantry ghost." He confessed that the case had always stuck with him. A deeply unsettling puzzle with no solution. I told him about the news report, about the cult, about the symbol. I could almost hear the tumblers clicking into place in his mind. Another long pause. "It's been 10 years on," he said, more to himself than to me. "But that's the first real thing we've ever had to go on." An hour later, we had a plan. We would meet for coffee the next morning, and on Saturday, we would take a drive out to Westwood County, to an abandoned compound where a ghost story, we hoped, might finally get an ending. For days after meeting Leo, the world seemed a little softer, the colors a little brighter debater, as if a long-held breath had finally been released. I found myself replaying that hour in the group home, the weight of 10 years lifting each time I remembered his quiet voice, his small, hesitant smile, and the way his eyes, older than any 17-year-old's should be, softened when he spoke of hope. Sometimes I would turn the wooden bird over in my hand, marveling at how something so simple could carry so many memories.
of fear, of longing, of survival, of kindness given and received. It sat on my desk beside its twin, the rough, thumb-sized token from that impossible night, and together they seemed to whisper that even the most broken beginnings can lead to something whole.
Leo and I stayed in touch. Our conversations were never about the darkness, but about what came after. He told me he was learning to carve new things, foxes, rabbits, even a tiny, delicate tree. He was thinking about college, about helping kids who had been through what he had. Sometimes, when he was lonely or uncertain, he would call just to hear a familiar voice on the other end of the line. Each time, I felt a quiet pride swell in my chest, a pride not born of heroism, but of small, steady persistence. One spring morning, a small package arrived on my doorstep. Inside was a bird, beautifully carved, sanded smooth, with a tiny loop of blue string. Tucked underneath was a note in Leo's careful hand. "Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for remembering. You were the first light in the dark." I hung the bird in my study window, where it caught the sun and cast gentle shadows on the wall. My daughter, now grown, sometimes pauses by the window and asks about it. I tell her the story, not the story of fear or scars, but the story of a boy who survived, of what it means to be brave, and of how sometimes the smallest kindness changes everything. Looking back, I realize not every mystery is meant to be solved, nor every wound meant to vanish completely. But I understand now that we carry each other's stories, that a single act of compassion, no matter how fleeting, can echo across years, across lives, reshaping even the darkest memory into something quietly beautiful. There are still nights when I check the locks, when old anxieties rattle the windows of my mind. But I also remember the boy who became a young man, who learned to carve his own future from the splinters of his past. And I remember that, sometimes. We are given the chance to be the light for someone lost in the dark, even if just for a moment. That is enough. That is everything. To properly set the stage for this story, you need to understand the geography of my life, the small room where I both work and sleep. It's a ground floor space at the very front of a classic British terrace townhouse, the kind with thin walls where you occasionally hear the muffled drama of your neighbors' lives. Just outside my window lies a small, slightly overgrown garden, a buffer between my world and the quiet cul-de-sac. The window itself is the room's main feature, a huge set of 3 bay windows. The left and right panels open from the bottom, creating wide, accessible gaps. This design is a relic of a time before the UK's weather decided to emulate the Mediterranean, and in the sweltering, sticky heat of recent summers, those openings are a non-negotiable lifeline to any passing breeze. They also create an obvious vulnerability. When open, there's an invitation at a height that someone could simply step over and into my room. For years, this never registered as a genuine threat. I'm a creature of the night, so my working hours are inverted. I sleep during the day when the world is bright and busy, and any potential intruder would be laughably conspicuous. At night, I'm awake, bathed in the glow of my monitor. Who would be foolish enough to climb into an occupied room? Even if they were, I reasoned, I'd hear the distinct click of the garden gate, the crunch of their footsteps on the gravel path. A break-in while I was present just didn't seem plausible. It was a risk I'd mentally filed away as statistically insignificant, until a chain of seemingly unrelated events conspired to make it a reality. There's one more detail you need to know. I don't have curtains. When the old, drafty window frames were replaced a few years back, I never got around to paying for new curtains to be fitted. I despise them. I hate how they suffocate a room, blocking the very air I so desperately crave, and how they swallow the precious natural light. For sleeping in the daytime, a simple sleep mask does the trick perfectly. The room was my sanctuary, tailored to my specific comforts. Then, the council intervened. They replaced the old street light right outside my window. What was once a warm, nostalgic orange glow that painted the garden in soft tones was ripped out and replaced by a harsh, clinical white LED. It was less a light and more an interrogation lamp, a miniature sun that completely bleached my front garden and blasted a sterile floodlight directly through my window. These things are supposed to be fitted with rear guards to prevent light from trespassing onto private property. But ours were installed without them. We complained, the whole street did, but our grievances vanished into the void of municipal bureaucracy. Nothing was ever done. My solution was a cheap but effective canvas fold-out screen, printed with a calming image of a forest. It was perfect. I could move it, angle it, and close it at will, shielding my eyes from the artificial daylight without sealing myself in a tomb. It worked beautifully for a couple of years, becoming just another piece of the room's furniture. Until one night, very recently, there was a sharp pop from outside my window. I was sitting in my chair against the opposite wall, the screen positioned between me and the window, when the sound cut through the silence. It took a moment to register, but then a slow smile spread across my face. The streetlight had blown. Fine by me. That annoying piece of council-mandated misery had been dazzling me for years. I wasn't going to shed a tear for its demise. My satisfaction, however, was short-lived. An hour later, my own power didn't just flicker, it died completely, plunging the room into a darkness so absolute it felt physical. I sat there, frozen, in a blackness that was almost perfect. Far in the distance, I could eventually make out the faint, intermittent sound of drilling and the clank of metal. They were doing electrical work, and my street was collateral damage. The last time this had happened without warning, the power was out for 2 hours. That was in the early evening. This was just past midnight. My phone, my only source of light, sat at a precarious 48% battery. I don't have torches lying around. It's just not something I'd ever needed. I tried to read a Superman comic by the phone's glow, but the small screen in the vast darkness was a strain on my eyes. You see, I'm disabled and not particularly steady on my feet. The thought of navigating my cluttered house in the pitch dark, risking a fall, was not appealing. So, I eventually switched off my phone to conserve its precious life, placed the comic book on the side table, and just relaxed into the chair, letting the silence and the dark wash over me. I have no idea how long I was asleep when I woke. The power was still off. For a disorienting second, I forgot why it was so profoundly dark. When you're used to the constant hum of light pollution, its sudden absence is deeply unsettling. It's an eerie, primal darkness that swallows sound and smothers the senses. You can't see 2 feet in front of you, which means you most certainly can't see what's making the soft, deliberate scraping and dragging sound that just pulled you from sleep. I listened, my body rigid, every nerve ending firing. I could vaguely perceive movement
in the space where the screen should be. Was it falling over? My mind scrambled for a rational explanation. No. The sound was too controlled. My blood ran cold. No. It was being folded back. In the dead of night, in a powerless house on a blacked-out street, someone had climbed through my open window while I slept. And they were now in the small gap between the window and the screen, methodically clearing their path into my room. I strained my eyes, desperate to pierce the gloom. I thought I could see the dark shape of a hand wrapped around the screen's edge, but it was like trying to see a shadow in a cave. As the last panel of the screen was pushed aside, a sliver of anemic light from a crescent moon bled into the room. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to confirm that yes, a person had climbed through my window and was now carefully, quietly, moving my screen. The faint moonlight sketched a thin outline of their form, but I remained completely engulfed in the darkness on my side of the room. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, a wild, panicked rhythm in the suffocating silence. What kind of person was this? What did they want? They could have a weapon. My mind flashed to images of knives glinting in the dark. They seemed thin, of average height, and as they took a shaky step into the room, their heads swiveled, trying to map out a path in the unfamiliar blackness. My room is cluttered, to be charitable, and they almost immediately brushed against a table. A soft thud. Then I heard the scrape of their foot nudging a cardboard box. A jolt of pure terror shot through me. There was no way I could just sit here, a silent statue in a chair, and wait for their eyes to adjust, for them to see me, for them to panic and attack. I had one single, desperate option. It was a gamble, but it was the only one I had. Summoning every bit of practice and control from my work as a horror creator, I took a slow, silent breath. From the depths of the impenetrable darkness where I sat, unseen and unheard, I let out a low, guttural growl. "Get out," I rasped, the voice barely human. "Before you can't live to regret it." This was it, the moment of truth. Either my performance would save me, or I was about to be stabbed. The figure jerked as if struck by lightning, letting out a strangled gasp. They flailed backward, clattering hard against something, the table maybe, and then absolutely scrambled, a clumsy, panicked whirlwind of motion, back towards the window and out into the night. My God, I think I scared him even more than he'd scared me. Adrenaline surged through me. I fumbled for my phone, knocking it onto the floor before grabbing it, turning on the flashlight, and rushing to the window. I shone the beam down the empty street. I caught a fleeting glimpse of him. He looked like an older teenager, maybe, as he legged it around the corner and disappeared. I didn't call the police. Perhaps I should have, but I knew with a weary certainty they would do nothing. All he did was briefly enter my property and then leave. No theft, no assault. But in that terrifying moment, as I saw that silhouette peering around my screen in the damn darkness, I had never been more afraid in my entire life. And hot damn, I am definitely going to be a lot more careful about leaving that window open. My name is Nathan, and in the summer of 2008, I was invincible. I worked for a major insurance firm in the heart of London, a towering glass cathedral dedicated to money. We sold complex policies to massive construction firms, and for what was essentially a junior role, I was paid an obscene amount of money. Life was a blur of sharp suits, client lunches at Michelin-starred restaurants, and weekends that evaporated in a haze of overpriced cocktails. I was young, single, and my disposable income was a joke, even by London standards, and the city hummed with the energy of limitless growth, and I was riding the crest of the wave. We all thought it would last forever. But then came the Great Reckoning, the event history now calls the financial crisis, and the entire shimmering facade of our world came crashing down. Everything went down the toilet. I lost my job just days after Lehman Brothers collapsed, sending a shockwave of panic through the global markets. The atmosphere in the office had gone from cocky confidence to a silent, collective dread overnight. Men who had screamed million-pound deals into their phones were now just staring blankly at terminal screens glowing red with catastrophic losses. Then came the emails, the grim invitations to short, sterile meetings where our lives were dismantled in under 5 minutes. I walked out of that building for the last time with my life in a cardboard box, stepping out onto a street that felt like a different city to the one I'd entered that morning in. I had a bit of cash saved up, a healthy nest egg for my bonus, so I wasn't as hard up as some. But as the weeks bled into months and the job market seized up completely, that nest egg kept getting smaller and smaller. The headlines were filled with stories of bailouts and bankruptcies, but all I saw was the number in my bank account shrinking with terrifying speed. Once I was eligible, I swallowed my pride and applied for job seekers allowance. The humiliation was a physical thing. I went from a world of tailored suits and boardroom meetings to sitting on a worn plastic chair in a drab, soulless job center, proving to a bored bureaucrat that I was actively looking for work that simply didn't exist. That government payment only went so far, and my savings kept shrinking as I held out for another finance job, clinging to the hope that my old life would somehow reappear. Then finally, with my account balance approaching a critical level, I did something I never thought I was capable of. I did something very, very silly. I got in touch with an old mate of mine named Scott and asked him for a big favor. Scott and I had been inseparable through school, but we drifted apart at university. While I was chasing a career in the city, Scott got deeply into ganja. He wasn't a burnout. He had a proper job as a graphic designer and paid his bills, but his evenings were a predictable ritual of zoning out, smoking copious amounts of weed, and playing GTA 4. I'd never even touched the stuff. The very idea of smoking anything repulsed me. I was terrified of what it would do to my lungs. So, you can imagine Scott's surprise when I, Nathan, the straight-laced finance guy, called him out of the blue and asked if he could get me some weed. When I went over to his flat, the air thick with the sweet, acrid smell I'd always hated, we made awkward small talk, catching up on years of missed life. Then I cut to the chase. I started grilling him, how much he smoked a week, what it cost, the quality, where he got it from. He looked at me, a confused smile on his face, and asked if I wanted to try it for the first time. No, I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my gut. I want to try selling it. I'll never forget the look on his face. He stared at me as if I'd just announced I was moving to Mars. But after I laid out the whole grim story, the job, the shrinking savings, the soul-crushing despair of the job center, it started to make a bit more sense to him. He saw the desperation in my eyes. We talked late into the night, dissecting every aspect of the trade. Scott had never sold himself, but as a longtime customer, he knew the landscape. After a tense call to his dealer to vouch for me, Scott passed me a number. A meeting was set. I started small, a few ounces a week, sold only to Scott and a tight circle of his friends whom I knew personally. The plan was to keep things contained, safe, and just profitable enough to stop the bleeding in my bank account. But the money was intoxicating. It was so easy. And after a while, my new, small customer base started pushing me to allow people I didn't know to call over. I was dead against it at first. It felt like crossing a line, a step into a much more dangerous world. But then, I did the maths. A few more customers could mean hundreds of pounds more a week. The allure of that kind of cash, when I was counting every penny, was too strong. I changed my mind fast. By the time my customer base hit double figures, I was easily covering all the bills that the job seeker's allowance wouldn't touch. A massive weight lifted from my shoulders. I kept up with my job-seeking commitments, though I genuinely wanted out. This was just a stopgap, a temporary measure to survive the storm. I hated the constant low-level paranoia, the feeling of looking over my shoulder every time a police car drove past. And then, one day, as the first green shoots of market recovery began to show, I landed a job. The pay wasn't anywhere near as generous as my old role, and I was facing a long, arduous probation period. But it was a way back in. Getting back into an office, any office, was infinitely preferable to the life-sapping depression of the job center. I took the position immediately and carried on selling to Scott & Company, telling myself I'd stop the moment that first legitimate payslip arrived. Then it did. I remember looking at the payslip on my laptop screen, a wave of relief washing over me. This was it. The end of the nightmare. I pulled out my phone, navigated to my dealer's contact, and my thumb hovered over the delete button. But I couldn't do it. I stared at the screen, a new calculation running through my mind. I was making hundreds of pounds a week, tax-free, for doing next to nothing. And I was doing it in a way that I'd convinced myself was completely safe and secure. It was a closed loop, no loose ends, and when it came to giving up that extra income, all I could think was, why should I? I sometimes wonder if I had just pressed that button and stopped right then and there, if I would have avoided what was coming. But a dark part of me thinks it wouldn't have mattered. It was already too late. Fast forward about 3 or 4 months. I was settling into the rhythm of my new life. Corporate drone by day, discreet cannabis supplier by night. The two worlds existed in a precarious, silent balance. I was still selling to that same small, curated group of customers, a system I foolishly believed was airtight. It was a Wednesday night. I'd been asleep for about 3 hours when a sudden, violent noise from downstairs jolted me from my dreams. I shot up in bed, my heart hammering against my ribs. My alarm clock glowed with the numbers 2:03, a detail that would be seared into my memory forever. The sound repeated itself, a sharp, concussive bang, bang, bang of a fist slamming against my front door. My blood ran cold. I crept to the top of the stairs, my ears straining in the suffocating silence of the house. And then I heard the words I had prayed I would never hear. Police, open the door. For months, I had lived with a low-grade fear of this exact moment, but I had also meticulously prepared for it. My hiding places were ingenious, born of paranoia and a desperate need for control. I was confident they could tear my entire house apart and not find a single incriminating banknote or a single baggie of weed. And in that moment of supreme, arrogant confidence, I made one of the worst mistakes of my entire life. I walked downstairs to open the door. Before I reached it, the man on the other side gave it another deafening blow and announced himself as the police again. "All right, I'm coming," I called out, my voice surprisingly steady as I prepped myself to play the part of the indignant, law-abiding citizen woken in the middle of the night. I undid both locks, nice and slow, using the seconds to compose myself, to smooth the fear from my face. But when I pulled his door open, a torrent of raw terror washed over me, so intense I nearly filled my boxers. It wasn't the police. It was a group of men in black balaclavas, their eyes cold and dead, holding tools, hammers, wrenches, crowbars, like medieval weapons. I stared at them for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a fraction of a second. A frozen tableau of horror. Then my survival instinct kicked in, and I tried to slam the door in their faces, but I was too slow. The man who had been banging on the door, the one with the steel-toed boots, jammed his foot in the opening. Another one rushed forward, slamming his shoulder into the wood with brutal force. The door frame splintered, the lock gave way, and the door flew from my grip as they shoved their way inside. I turned and ran for the kitchen, my only thought being the back door that led to the garden. But I kept that one locked, too. My fingers fumbled with the key, shaking uncontrollably, when one of them was suddenly on me, his hand grabbing the collar of my shirt. I tried to shove him off, to fight back, but he had a hammer. One swift, sickening blow to my side was all it took to extinguish any thought of resistance. I collapsed against the back door, my hands raised in surrender, babbling about how they could take whatever they wanted, just please don't hurt me anymore. I thought it was just an unusually aggressive burglary, that they'd take my TV and laptop and be on their way. But I was wrong. Dead wrong. The man with the hammer backed off, and the one who seemed to be the leader, the one who'd been banging on the door, stepped forward. He pointed a heavy wrench at my face, and his voice was a low, chilling growl. "If you don't cooperate," he said, "we will kill you." I just nodded, a pathetic, jerky movement of my head. He grabbed me by the hair and dragged me into the living room. Another man pulled a length of blue plastic cord from his hoodie pocket. Panic surged through me again as I realized they were going to tie me up. A couple more threats, a flash of the hammer, and I submitted. The rope was preferable to having my skull caved in. They tied my wrists tightly behind my back, then bound my ankles and knees together before shoving me roughly onto the couch. "Take whatever you want," I pleaded again, my voice hoarse with fear. I expected them to start hauling my possessions out to a waiting van, but instead, they started asking me where my stash spots were. For the second time that night, that horrible, sinking feeling of dread filled my stomach. My big secret, the one I had guarded so fiercely, wasn't a secret anymore. I tried playing ignorant at first, stammering that I didn't know what they were talking about. It didn't wash. One of them began bashing my legs with something heavy, a blunt, repetitive impact that sent waves of agony through my body. I screamed, but another one clamped a hand over my mouth, muffling the sound. They kept hitting me, over and over, while the leader's voice hissed in my ear. "Where is it?" I don't know how, but I found the will to play ignorant again. The thought of losing all that cash, a couple of £1,000 by that point, kept my mouth shut. For a fleeting moment, I was amazed at my own resilience, that I could withstand this kind of torture. But then, they upped the ante. One of them produced a pair of pliers and threatened to start cutting off my toes. I broke. The moment I felt the cold metal close around the tip of my big toe, I screamed at them to stop. I told them everything. I gave them the exact locations of the money and the ounce bags of weed hidden away upstairs. Two of them stayed to watch me while the others ran upstairs. I heard them tearing my room apart, and then a triumphant shout, "Found it!" They came back down holding the cash and the weed. The leader inspected the hall, then ordered his men out of the house, but not before turning to one of them and saying, "Put him to sleep." My heart stopped. This was it. They were going to kill me to make sure there were no witnesses. I was almost relieved when the man who approached me simply drew back his fist. The punch landed squarely on my jaw, and the world dissolved into a fuzzy, black void. When I next opened my eyes, the house was silent. The masked men were gone. I remembered being robbed, but in the daze, the fact that I was tied up had slipped my mind. It was only when I tried to move that the panic returned, hot and suffocating. My bosses wouldn't call the police if I missed a day of work. They'd just assume I was sick. I could be stuck here for days, waiting for someone to find me. That thought scared me more than the beating. Adrenaline surged through me, and despite the searing pain, I fought against the ropes, twisting and pulling until my wrists were raw and bleeding. It was no use. They were too tight. My eyes darted around the room and landed on the home phone on the coffee table. I began to hop, a clumsy, agonizing journey across the room. I managed to kick the table hard enough to send the phone crashing to the floor, knocking the handset off the cradle and giving me a dial tone. Then, using my nose and chin, I painstakingly dialed the only number I knew by heart, my dealer's, and he didn't answer the first few times. With each unanswered call, my hope dwindled. Finally, just as I was about to give up, he answered with a groggy, "Yo." I croaked that it was an emergency, that he had to come to my place right away. He mumbled something about having his kid with him, probably thinking I was after a late-night re-up. But when I told him what had happened, his tone changed instantly. He said he'd be there as soon as he could. I told him where to find the spare key in the garden, and after he hung up, I just lay there, praying he would show up. About half an hour later, I heard someone in the back garden. It was him, true to his word. The wave of relief that washed over me was overwhelming. He let himself in, cut away the ropes, and helped me to my feet. He couldn't stay long. His daughter was asleep in the car, but before he left, he told me I was lucky. He told me stories of others who had been hit by the same crew. One man who had a hot clothing iron pressed to his chest. Another whose knees were smashed to pieces with a sledgehammer. As he stood by the door, ready to leave, I asked him, "What do I do now? I can't call the police." He looked at me, his face grim. "Move," he said. "Move to the other side of the city if you can. Because once they find you, they always come back." I took his advice. It wrecked me financially, breaking my lease and finding a new place. But wild horses couldn't have stopped me. There was no way I was going to risk going through that again. I finally stopped selling, too. I had always known I wasn't cut out for that life, that it was only ever supposed to be a temporary fix. But seeing and experiencing the brutal reality of that world up close was another thing entirely. There are some very, very bad men in this world, and it's a cold comfort, but a comfort nonetheless, to know that I am not one of them. My name is Sarah. I'm just about to turn 30, and I want to share my story, my own personal horror movie that played out in the quiet corners of my life last year. It was a stressful, terrifying time, and finding a community that understood the nature of unseen monsters helped me more than you can imagine. So, I thought I could thank you by telling you what happened to me. It started on a Tuesday in April, the kind of unremarkable evening that makes up most of your life. My 7-year-old daughter, Mia, was asleep in the room next door, her breathing a soft, rhythmic comfort in the silent house. I was lying in bed, bathed in the cool blue light of my phone, scrolling mindlessly through Instagram. It was my nightly ritual, a way to switch off my brain. That's when a notification popped up at the top of my screen, a message request. I get them from time to time, usually bots or scammers with sketchy links and profiles full of stolen photos. My usual reaction is a swift, dismissive tap of the block button. But this one felt different. The profile picture was of a girl, smiling brightly at a local cafe I recognized. The username was just a normal name, and the message itself wasn't a link or a sales pitch. It just said, "Hi." Curiosity got the better of me. I clicked on the profile. It looked completely legitimate. The girl lived in my city. We were about the same age, and we had a few mutual followers from a local parenting group I was in. I figured there had to be some plausible connection I was just forgetting. Not wanting to be rude, I replied, "Sorry, do we know each other?" adding a little smiley face to soften the question. The reply came almost instantly, just 2 minutes later. But when I opened the chat, there wasn't a new line of text. Instead, there was a voice note, a solid purple bar indicating a recording that was a full minute long. A whole minute? That seemed odd for a stranger. Still, I had no real reason to feel alarm. Scammers called old ladies pretending to be from the government. They didn't send cryptic voice notes on Instagram. I pressed play, and in the space of a single heartbeat, the comfortable quiet of my bedroom was shattered. The first 2 words turned the blood in my veins to ice. "Hello, Sarah." It wasn't a human voice. It was a grotesque imitation, a text-to-speech AI so basic and toneless that it sounded like a machine learning to speak by reading a horror script. The pronunciation was stilted, the cadence all wrong, creating a sound that was profoundly unsettling. In any other context, it might have been laughable. But hearing it alone in the dark, with my daughter sleeping just a wall away, it was the most terrifying sound I had ever heard. A full-body dread washed over me, a primal instinct to burrow under my covers and disappear. The voice continued, its metallic drone filling my ears. "I've been watching you for quite some time, and I've decided you have to die. But not just you. Your daughter needs to die, too." My breath hitched in my throat. It went on, describing in sickening, methodical detail how someone would force me to watch as they hurt Mia before they killed her, followed by a litany of other vile threats that made my stomach churn. But the part that propelled me out of bed, the detail that had me scrambling to the window to frantically scan the dark, empty street, was when it started describing my home. It knew the color of our front door. It knew about the chipped flagstone on the walkway. And it wasn't just the house. The voice knew Mia's name, her age, and the name of her elementary school. The message ended as coldly as it began. "Enjoy your final days, Sarah. Because I'm going to enjoy ending them." When the recording finished, the silence that rushed back in was somehow worse. It felt heavy, malevolent. For a full minute, I just lay there, paralyzed by a storm of fear and confusion. I knew I should call the police, but my mind raced with doubt. What would they do? Take a report, tell me to be careful, and leave? I couldn't bear the thought of being alone after they left. I needed someone here, now, a physical presence to stand between me and the monster on my phone. So, I called Mark. Our relationship was complicated. We'd dated on and off for a year, and though we'd officially broken up a few months back, we'd fallen back into a comfortable, familiar pattern. He was wonderful with Mia. My parents liked him, and he was the person I called when my sink was leaking or my car made a weird noise. He was my rock. The only real issue, the one that kept us from truly getting back together, was his drinking. When he drank, he became a stranger, irritable, sullen, someone I couldn't have around my daughter. He'd refused to quit entirely, but he had cut back significantly, which was why I still kept him in my life. And in that moment of pure terror, he was the only person I could think of. He answered on the second ring, his voice thick with sleep, but as soon as he heard me sobbing, he was wide awake. He didn't hesitate. I'm on my way. 20 minutes later, he was sitting on my sofa, his arms wrapped around me as I cried. I couldn't bring myself to listen to that monstrous voice again, so I handed him my phone, and he took it into the kitchen. I watched his silhouette through the doorway, his head bent as he listened. When he came back, his face was a mixture of raw fury and genuine fear. He told me we had to call the cops, and while I already knew that, he gave me a surge of hope I desperately needed. He started talking about all the new techniques law enforcement had for tracking cyberstalkers. It's not like 10 years ago, he said, his voice firm. They won't just tell you to block the account and move on. They have entire departments for this. Sarah. They can trace IP addresses, digital footprints, everything. We can stop this before it goes any further. He told me to sleep in my bed while he took the couch, but he didn't sleep. Every time I cracked my eyes open, I could see the glow of his phone as he sat vigil, reading about the experiences of other stalking victims, trying to arm us with knowledge. The next morning, I called in sick to work, my nerves completely shot. Mark, despite being up all night, went to his own job, promising to come straight back the moment he clocked out. I called the police, and a few days later, a detective who specialized in cyberstalking came to my house. She laid out a clear playbook. I was worried she'd dismiss it, but she did the opposite. She was methodical, serious. Do not delete anything, she warned. Do not block them. I need you to document everything. Every message, every voice note, every new username. It's all evidence. And the evidence started pouring in. A flood of new Instagram accounts appeared, one after another. They all sent innocent opening messages like "Hey" or "Question," designed to bypass the app's spam filters. I knew that the moment I accepted the request, another horrifying voice note would be waiting. I never listened to them. I couldn't. I just let them pile up in my inbox, a digital collection of threats for the police. But my stalker must have realized I wasn't listening, because after a week, the strategy changed. One night, as I was in the bathroom, my phone buzzed on the counter, a missed call from an unknown number. Not no caller ID, but a full 10-digit number I didn't recognize. My heart hammered against my ribs. A new voicemail notification appeared. The detective had called me from a blocked number before, so I hoped it was an update. With a trembling hand, I listened. It wasn't the detective. It was that same dead, robotic voice. I only heard a few seconds before I slammed my phone down and hung up, but it was enough. The monster was no longer just on Instagram. It had my personal phone number. It was getting closer. That second robotic message sent me into a full-blown panic attack. I broke down completely, sobbing on the bathroom floor. The monster wasn't just a random troll anymore. It had found a way to reach past the anonymity of social media and into the core of my private life. And just like the first time, my immediate instinct was to call Mark. He drove over without a moment's hesitation, arriving to find a scene of total chaos. My loud, ragged crying had woken Mia, and by the time Mark walked through the door, she was crying too, terrified by my terror. The first thing he did was scoop her into his arms. He was so amazing with her, his voice low and soothing. He told her that Mommy was just scared, but that he was there now, and everything was going to be just fine. He got her calmed down and tucked back into bed before turning his full attention to me, holding me until my own sobs subsided. The next morning, he insisted on driving Mia to school so I wouldn't have to face the world. While he was gone, I called the cyber-stalking detective, my voice shaking as I gave her the phone number from the voicemail. She thanked me and said they'd look into it. Then she offered a small, thin piece of hope. Sometimes they just get bored and move on. For a little while, I dared to believe her. The torrent of Instagram messages slowed to a trickle, and my phone remained silent. A fragile sense of calm began to settle over the house. I started to think maybe the escalation had been a final, desperate act, and that the stalker had, in fact, gotten bored. But my stalker wasn't bored. They were just getting started. One night, while Mia was staying over at my mom's, she had offered to take her for a few days to give me a break. The true nightmare began. I had just gotten out of the shower and was wrapped in a towel when I heard it, a deafening bang on my front door. It wasn't a knock. It was a violent, percussive slam, like someone was throwing their entire body weight against the wood. Then another and another. It was a sound of pure rage, designed to do one thing: terrify me. I was so glad Mia wasn't home to hear it. My first move was to slam and lock my bedroom door, my wet hands fumbling with the knob. I grabbed my phone and slid down to the floor, pressing my back against the door as if I could hold it shut. This time, I didn't call Mark. I called 911. 911, what is your emergency? The dispatcher's voice was calm, a stark contrast to the frantic hammering that was still echoing through my house. I whispered that I had a stalker, and I thought he was trying to break in. Do you fear for your life? She asked, her tone sharpening. Yes, I choked out. Yes, I do. She sent 2 patrol cars immediately and stayed on the line with me, her voice a steady anchor in my sea of panic. The furious banging continued, a relentless assault on my sanctuary. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse. A moment later, I heard the short, sharp burst of a police siren, a signal to let me know they were there. The dispatcher told me to stay put while the officers secured the property. A few minutes later, which felt like an eternity, she told me the area was clear and that I needed to go downstairs and open the door for the officers. The next day, I spoke with the detective again. Her advice was blunt and unequivocal. You can't stay there, Sarah. Not right now. And just like that, I became a guest in my childhood home, sleeping in my mom's spare room with Mia. It was a small silver lining, being close to my mom. But it didn't last. A few days later, I drove back to my house to grab more clothes. The moment I walked in, I knew something was wrong. Nothing looked stolen or smashed, but the air was heavy, violated. I walked into the kitchen, and my heart stopped. A piece of printer paper was pinned to my fridge by a magnet. On it were 3 words and an emoji, a cheerful symbol twisted into something menacing. I see you. That was the worst moment for me, the realization that I had no safe place left. My home was no longer my own. I leaned heavily on my mom, but Mark was a constant presence. He was my shadow, always checking in, always ready with a comforting word. He even offered to let Mia and me stay at his place, but I gently declined, figuring it was better for Mia to be with her grandmother. It also gave Mark and me a place to be alone, which we both seemed to need. For 2.5 weeks, this was my life, a strange limbo of fear and displacement. Then, one afternoon, the cyberstalking detective called and asked if she could visit. We met at my mom's house. When she arrived, she sat me down at the kitchen table and said, "I have good news and bad news." The good news was what I had been praying to hear for weeks. They had found my stalker. A wave of relief so powerful it almost made me dizzy washed over me, and I broke into a wide, tearful smile. But the detective wasn't smiling. She looked at me with an expression of profound sympathy. She explained that my stalker had been clever, using all sorts of digital tricks to cover their tracks. But they made one mistake. When they created that very first Instagram account, they used a photo of that girl from the cafe. They didn't scrub the metadata from the image file, which allowed the police to trace the exact device and location where it was uploaded. "Bingo," she said softly. "That's how we got him." She told me they were planning to make the arrest that day, but she wanted me to hear it from her first. I was practically vibrating with anticipation, desperate to know the name of the monster who had destroyed my peace. I was so focused on that, I never stopped to consider why learning his identity could possibly be bad news. Then, she just said it, her voice gentle. "There's no easy way to say this, Sarah. I am so sorry to be the one to tell you, but the person stalking you is Mark, your friend." My mind went completely blank. It was as if my brain simply refused to process the words. It had to be a mistake. "No," I said, shaking my head. "That's not possible. Mark is my ex-boyfriend. He's been my rock through all of this. We were even talking about getting back together." I pleaded with her, telling her how he'd held me while I cried, how he'd stayed up all night to protect me. She just watched me with a look of deep, heartbreaking pity. She rehashed the evidence, explaining that if it wasn't Mark who used his computer to create that profile, they needed to find out who did. A tiny, foolish ray of hope flickered within me, but it was extinguished when she told me what happened next. Once the police showed up at Mark's apartment and told him he was facing serious jail time, he confessed to everything. It still didn't feel real until the detective came over a second time and showed me the video of his interrogation. And there he was, my Mark, sitting in a sterile room, his face puffy from crying. She fast-forwarded to the part she said I needed to see, the part where he explained why. He told the interviewing officer he did it all, in his own words. So she'd need me. He had created the monster so he could be the hero who saved me from it. Every comforting hug, every reassuring word, every moment he spent protecting me was a lie, a carefully constructed piece of theater in a sick game of his own creation. The detective said that because he had no prior offenses, and had confessed. He likely wouldn't see the inside of a prison, but a judge would issue an emergency restraining order. And if he ever came near me or Mia again, he'd go straight to jail. That was the first piece of real good news I'd had in a month. I wanted him out of my life, out of my memory, out of everything. It made me physically ill to think we had been intimate while he was secretly orchestrating my living hell. Thankfully, when the story got out, our entire circle of friends turned on him. Shamed and ostracized, Mark ended up leaving town and moving across the country. It felt like a small measure of justice, knowing he had ruined his own life just as he had tried to ruin mine. Wherever he went, I hope he's rotting there,